Hello and welcome to the Michael Harding podcast, and I have two readings for you today. The first I wrote in the Irish Times about 8 years ago, and I'll just read it as it is and you'll understand why I'm reading it. I dreamt that the president of Russia was a cuckoo on my roof, and he was shaking the chimney. Our chimney is not in good condition, and sometimes in winter the strong winds blow and the rains go up the tiles underneath the flashing, and the white walls of the kitchen turn brown along the line of the chimney breast. So the idea of the president of all the Russias up there with claw feet shaking the chimney pot was not doing me any good at all. What was worse, he was wearing no clothes, and his skin was covered in feathers. Of course, this was only a dream, but I didn't know that, because we don't know we're dreaming when we are dreaming. Then I thought I was lying outside on the grass beneath the clear sky, and the cuckoo flew off the chimney and hovered above me, blocking the light. That's when I woke up, terrified in bed. It was about 7 a.m. in the morning. In the distance I could hear the real Mr. Cuckoo singing his heart out. Later that morning I was in the studio, wandering, doing this and that, not really working very hard, but I was wondering if it was time to close up the stove for the summer, when a swallow flew in the glass patio door. It was open, carved a circle in the air above me, and landed on one of the rafters that crosses the apex roof. "I used to live here," he said. I said, "No, you never did. This room was only built last year." "Well," he said in swallow language, "there was a green shed here on this exact spot when I came in previous summers, and it's gone." He eyed me with an aggressive little eye. The thought occurred to me that, although he was not as big as Mr. Putin, he could blind me with his beak fairly fast if he had the inclination. "Yes," I confessed, "there was a green galvanized shed here, but I was obliged to take it down in order to build this lovely studio." "Well," he said, "it's not so lovely for me, is it? Where am I supposed to go for the next 5 months to rear 2 new batches of little swallows?" There was a black, oily colour to his shoulders. It was almost blue. "Can I stay here?" he seemed to ask, as he shifted sideways on the rafter. "That would be lovely," I said, "except that my beautiful wooden floor would be destroyed with bird poo, and I couldn't keep the door open all the time, so if you were coming and going, you might bang your head off the glass and kill yourself. So the best thing is to go now, while the going is good." And I flapped my arms and off he flew. That afternoon I was in Mullingar, talking to a woman whose horse recently won a Grand Prix at an international show jumping competition in Paris. We were discussing the weather. "Windy day," I said. "Yes," she agreed, "but not cold." "I heard the cuckoo this morning," I declared, and as I spoke, the Cavan cat dashed across the patio in front of the house with a baby rabbit in its teeth. She's called the Cavan cat because she was run over by a car near Kilnilek in Cavan one time. Her back and 4 legs were broken, and her face almost squashed by the wheel of a lorry. The owner didn't want her anymore, but my friend in Mullingar insisted on paying a fortune to the vet to have everything fixed up. Now she's fine, except she has no tail. I remember winter evenings at the stove while my friend was tending to horses in the yard, and I'd be watching the cat trying to suck milk off a saucer with a wire brace in her mouth to hold the jawbone in place. I never thought she would mend, never mind have the strength to eat rabbits. I'm fond of cats, but nonetheless it didn't prevent me running out to save the rabbit. I chased her across the patio, tossing plastic chairs and a metal table where I had often sat on summer evenings drinking wine and eating beef steaks and talking about horses, but I couldn't catch her. Eventually she got behind a hedge and looked out at me like a jihadi warrior on her way to heaven, the victim still clenched in her gob. But by now the rabbit was dead. "Might as well leave her alone," my friend said, and she brought me down to see the swallow nests in the stables. Well, I suppose I wrote that in a way trying to meditate on the fact that there's a kind of a link where we slip into being animals, and there's a way that animals can be very human. You know, you can see animals as human, and sometimes you can see humans as animals. And obviously I thought I'd read it because of Mr. Putin's presence at the moment, like a big cuckoo sitting in the middle of Ukraine. More than a cuckoo now. He's more than a cuckoo. And it's a terrible thing to be thinking of Ukraine. And I was never in Ukraine. My beloved was in Ukraine, but I was never there. And I do know that there's a cathedral in Kiev. It's the Cathedral of St. Sophia. And somewhere behind the altar, or way up, you know, going up into the vault of the top of it, there's an icon of Mary, the Mother of God, with her two hands up like she's praying. You know, when your hands are up, like with the way the priest at the Eucharist has the hands up, and there she is. And that mosaic is on that wall for 1,000 years, and because of all the wars and because of the terrible times that come and go, and because the image, the icon is still there, it's called the indestructible wall. And there's a tradition that says that as long as Mary, the Mother of God, is there in her image, in the icon on the wall, a mosaic, as long as it's there on that indestructible wall, Kiev will be safe. Kiev will never be overcome. Can you imagine how that must be affecting the people of Kiev at the moment? The promise that this world is not all there is. Imagine the consolation. The promise that in some way the Great Mother will enfold us in her tenderness, will mind us, will bring us to the full awakening in Christ. Now, this is the mythic language of faith, but it seems to me that it's a powerful consolation. I have found it in my life a consolation. I think that I imagine that in somewhere in war, in a time of darkness, in a time where, you know, where it could seem like your entire life is going to be snuffed out and will be snuffed out. It's like, how can you have faith in those moments? How can you believe? It almost seems as well like an affront to other people. You know, if I say, you know, God save me from this illness, and then I get better and I think, oh, you know, I prayed to God and he helped me, he made me better. I'm suggesting that God intervened in history to save me, but the fellow beside me in the next bed who died, he didn't save him. And it's lopsided. There has to be an understanding that faith is a faith that the way you are minded by God is deeper than the surface level of life. And that's the consolation, I think, that affects us ultimately when we are really ill or when we are facing death. The consolation that even though this looks like the darkest night, even though this death that may be approaching us seems like annihilation, there has to be some part of us that reaches out in an act of hope to the universe, that something transcendent will hold us and will bring us into a space of safety or a union or absorption with the Godhead that we can't understand, but that vindicates us, as the sense that the righteous will be vindicated. You know, that God will not abandon us. And it's the real test of Christianity. It's the real core of that moment of crucifixion when you kind of use this idea, when you meditate and think about it. God will not abandon us. And yet you're talking about the story of a man crucified, death and dying. And Mary Magdalene, you know, when they were putting the body into the tomb, she was there, not just at the cross, but it says when she was there at the tomb when they were laying him in the tomb, and she wept, as anyone would who is so close to him. And then 2 angels spoke to her. And it's impossible, you know, to avoid the fact that in that moment you're in a transition moment, a transition to some sort of different plane of reality. You're no longer, the narrative is no longer on the surface. It's gone into the depth of consciousness of being. And so what you're being told in the next sentences is at a different level, not at the ordinary mundane level of life, the ordinary mundane level at which he died. And then there's deep, deep, deep space inside that. And Mary Magdalene sees 2 angels and an empty tomb. And she gradually realizes he is risen. So, I'm no theologian and I'm no professional on that, but it makes sense to me emotionally from my own experience that sometimes we pray and it works out well. And in those moments we have to be careful to understand that there is a complexity to life whereby you can feel God helped you in a situation, but also you can feel, you know, it's not a question of God living in a big room upstairs above the sky and getting the stairs down and intervening in our life, in our world, our cosmos, and fiddling with our history. It's not that kind of God that we believe in. We believe in just being. We are here, and there is nothing but God. And that even though it seems that everything ends in the grave, it seems as everything is destroyed, faith is this contrary idea. It is the transformation through a story that we are transformed in the resurrection, and that no matter how dark the night, some level of being says God does not abandon us. And the 20th century in the West of Europe was just like, well, I'm sorry, God has abandoned you. That's the facts. And you get Beckett and Sartre and Camus and you know, everybody else wakening up to the reality. Stop this religious nonsense. The truth is, you know, we are here existentially alone. It's fucking terrible. It's bloody awful. And that kind of, you know, almost pessimistic view of life. But it's a realistic view as well. And I mean, put together with that and the fact that the secular world has evolved medicines and ways to help human life intensely much better. Probably because they abandoned believing in God. You abandon all that hocus pocus and you say, let's just say we're here. It can be very painful. Let's try and find medicines that'll cure blindness and cure illnesses. It's not easy to figure this out, I say, for me personally. It's really, really difficult to hold on to faith. It's really difficult because, in a sense, everything that happens in the world we know is either a darkness that to believe in a God seems offensive, or alternatively, it's like, putting yourself before everybody else and having the kind of outrageous notion that God or Mary, the Mother of God, intervenes, opens the curtain, walks into the real world, fiddles with your life so that you get better of your illness, and then she goes off back up to heaven, cook her dinner, and eat her kippers on the range or something. I like the image of Mary, the Mother of God, cooking kippers and sitting at the range. But it's not quite the thing, is it? It's offensive to the person who doesn't get cured. So it's very difficult to believe in God in good times, and it's really harder to believe in Him than in bad times, in dark times, when you feel that you're being abandoned. That you feel you're approaching death, and part of it is probably to face up to that fact and to accept death and be accepting that your life is over. Why would you want to go on, for example? So many questions around that, And did people in earlier days believe in an afterlife simply because it was so unbearable in the real life? Maybe the life expectancy in some of these periods in early history wasn't 70. Maybe it was 40, 45. They were dying, they were suffering. They died without medicines. Maybe there was terrible pain. The whole idea on being poor when you were living, alive with no money, just beggars, just like slaving, and sometimes being slaves or serfs for powerful farmers or landlords or whatever. All you have to do is look at photographs of Ireland in the mid-19th century to just realise how far we've come from a destitution that's absolutely shocking. And it is the secular world which has given us so much science that has healed so many people from so many illnesses, and also it's science and the secular world which has, through its economies, raised the level for everybody, so that like millions and millions and millions of people have been taken out of poverty in the past 20 years. Really difficult to believe in God, to have faith in good times. In bad times, maybe somebody at the point of death, where there's no more options, or when you're living in a system like as if you were in Mariupol at the moment in Ukraine. How would you believe in God? How could you pray? And having said that, I just know instinctively that the people of Mariupol have courage and faith, and the people of Kiev have courage and faith, and that they will and are reaching out to the Mother, the Theotokos, the Mother of God, to enfold them in her tenderness. And maybe that's just comfort, or maybe there's a deeper level to it that I don't understand. All I know is that it's very, very difficult to have faith in good times, but it's fierce difficult also to have faith in bad times. And I fear that we're in bad times again. You know, we had COVID. I was doing this podcast because of COVID. I thought this is a good therapeutic thing to do for me for COVID. And maybe it'll help other people to share my story with other people. So I've been doing that for 2 years. Thought it was coming to an end. Again, I thought it was coming to an end. And we were all going to go out, forget the podcast, and go out and be happy and enjoy ourselves for the summer. And then Putin invaded Ukraine. And now where are we? I don't even know. I'm doing this podcast this week, and I don't know where I'm going to be, where the world is going to be next weekend. And it does frighten me. And it's hard to pray. But I'll tell you this. All I can say personally is I find it a huge help when I do pray. It puts me in the right frame of mind. I find a serenity when I pray. And I'm going to give you a way that prayer helps me. It's based on one of those old fellas in the desert in the 3rd century. I forget which one it was, but I saw the quote recently. It said, prayer is the absence of anger. And when I saw that, I agreed with it. It was like I recognized it. I said, that's how I feel. You've just put in words my experience of prayer. It's an absence of anger. I learned it from writing. Because the best writing also comes from a space that opens up when anger is subdued. You know, if you're writing a story or a book and your fingers are getting tight on the keyboard with a kind of a deep anger and you're feeding it into the words, my instinct is that you narrow down the possibilities of what you're writing. And when you're able to pull back, when you're able to acknowledge a sense of tightness in your body and anger in your heart, and you kind of let go of it by being, by doing mindful exercises or whatever. Eat an orange and look into the fire for 20 minutes. Loads of things can kind of get you away from the anger. But when you do get away from it, then you find you write better. And what happens in war is that the external tragedy and pornography of violence becomes something we attach ourselves to. There's a strange way that we connect with the conflict in, let's say, Ukraine at the moment, as if it was an emblem of our own inner conflict. We start projecting something out onto the actors. We see actors out there. Zelensky, good actor. Putin, bad actor. We see it playing out as a kind of a gigantic, crazy, gigantic chess game on the chessboard of Europe. And we have skin in the game. It's as if the players, the actors were emblematic of the conflicts inside us. And so whatever conflict I have inside me, I'm unconsciously projecting it out on them. And then we become enraged sometimes. We become enraged against people that we normally would love. It might be Russians, it might be somebody we know who's Russian, it might be, somebody who's on the other side of the political argument. At the moment, there are people on different sides of the political argument in relation to the war in Ukraine. There are people who you'll hear on the radio talking about wanting to go immediately, get a Kalashnikov, send me out, I'll shoot the bastards. And then there's other people who'd be saying, maybe the Ukrainians should do a deal. Maybe NATO was pushing Russia too far, all that sort of stuff. You get two sides of it. And we become enraged. We become like, a white heat of hatred against somebody who has made an argument, let's say, against NATO or for NATO. We become sucked into a real polemic. Our hearts become just on fire with anger because the anger that's going on the streets of Ukraine is something that we have no protection against it. We just absorb it, and it becomes our anger. Or we become one in solidarity with all Ukrainians. Heretofore, we might have had a very different view of them, you know. I remember being in a restaurant in Warsaw about 6-7 years ago, and I was talking to a friend of mine, he's Polish, and he was saying, Michael, do you know how many Ukrainians in this country? He said, so many. He was giving off that there was too many Ukrainians in his country. Now he loves them. Now he's out there day and night helping them and doing wonderful work for people who are suffering. So we change, and a war can make us change like that. It can bring out the heroic in us, but it can also bring out negativity and hatred in us. In general, it can unhinge us with rage. War brings to the surface and externalizes our own unformed, unshapen anger. And we become unhinged. We become full of rage. I have honestly never found a better definition of prayer. Prayer is the absence of anger. And the way it works is like this. Do whatever mindfulness, do whatever practice you want to bring you to a state of calm abiding, a state of concentrated mindfulness. As I say, for some people it's body checking your entire body. Some like to eat an orange and look at the flames and the fire. That's my favorite one. And some people do all sorts of different exercises. So let's say you get to a point of calm abiding, and you will notice then your anger. You'll notice that your anger, your emotions, you become aware of them inside, that they're flowing through you, and you try and quieten them down. They're like a fire, and don't put coals on it. Don't be adding ideas. Don't be meditating on visuals or images or narratives that are connected with the anger. Give yourself what they call in Tibetan Buddhism an antidote. Give yourself an alternative. If you come into the prayer room, the prayer hall, and somebody has already got there before you to where you usually sit, and they're sitting on your cushion, so you have to sit at the back on your arse, on the back heels of your feet, and you're sitting there looking at them. Now, if you focus on them, that fella took my cushion. I normally sit there. Now he's sitting there. Well, you're not going to be able to meditate. You're not going to be able to find calm abiding because you'll be full of anger. So if you find an antidote, rather than think about something else, look at the colours on the Buddha. Big statue of the Buddha on the shrine. Look at that. Look at the smoke coming up from the little incense sticks. Look at the lovely way that it squiggles up the air. And breathe in through your nostrils and smell it. And you do all these things, and after a while, you realise, God, there's a minute has passed and I haven't been thinking about the bastard who's sitting on my cushion. So you become a bit, that's the antidote. You're contemplate something else. Control your mind and bring it to something else. And gradually the anger dissipates. Because you could have anger about the way that people are being bombed, the way that people are dying, the way that people are just really doing this horrible thing called war. And it could get worse in the next couple of days. It could get worse in the next couple of weeks. And you get tied into it. And then it's hard to pray. But if you understand that prayer is actually the absence of anger, you have nothing to do except get rid of the anger. And then the funny thing is that the very the very subjects, ideas, or people that would have drawn you away from prayer, that would have disturbed you, become actually catalysts to help you. So, like, for example, somebody like Claire Daly now would raise such anger in me, such a fury in me, because of her political opinions. Well, it would raise such a fury in me that for me to control that fury is a huge job, and the bigger the job, then the bigger the achievement of peace at the end of it. So when I have come to terms with that, and then I am no longer angered by Claire Daly, and in fact, I bring her into the kind of visualized people I imagine, the people you like, the people you don't like, and the people you don't know, as you're doing a meditation. So I bring Claire in, and I think, well, you can sit down there in my imagination and I'll pray for you. I will wish you well. I will deeply wish that the energy in me, white light, goes out of me and into you, bringing you complete happiness and freedom from all suffering. We'll start doing that then, with somebody like Claire at the other end of it. I can't dislike her anymore. I have overcome my anger for her because of that's being like an antidote, and then things are fine. And the war would have that effect on me, so it gives me things to be angry about, it gives me people to be just terribly angry with, and so I have to overcome it, and then when I overcome it I find, I have good peace now, I have good calm abiding now, I have no anger. And if you ever get to a position of no anger in yourself for a moment, sit with it and never leave it. That'd be what I would do, because it's such a beautiful space to be. You couldn't be in a better spa, you couldn't be in a better jacuzzi, you couldn't be at a more lovely fireside than when you're sitting still and you're able to say, I don't now have any anger in me at the moment. The way you get to that space is you actually identify where the anger is and then use an antidote to overcome it. And when there's a war on, you'll find that it's very easy to see where the anger is coming from, because you will be feeling huge emotions of negativity and rage and hurt and woundedness in relation to Putin and in relation to soldiers, in relation to chemical weapons, in relation to the destruction of people's lives. You will be feeling so much anger, your blood will be boiling. And you'll be feeling it to people in Ireland as well, depending on which side of the political argument you're on, and which side of the political argument the other person is on. Obviously, there are many people who would find what Claire Daly says in Ireland heroic and truthful and wonderful, commend her on it. And then there are others like me whose blood would boil to listen to what she comes out with. But I recognise that it's a divided world and people have different opinions. And if you're just going to be on one side, you're never going to be a peacemaker anyway. And how do you heal that anger? You find the antidote. One antidote is just to think of something else, but another is to find a different way, where you start to situate in your prayer life, in your imagination. You think about people who are your enemies, your friends and strangers, and you gather all them around you before you do any meditation. And you make sure that you plonk whoever is your enemy or whoever makes your blood boil, that you put them there, you situate them, and that you send from your heart out to them big white light, big light of love, that they may be happy, that they may be free from all suffering. That in itself is the antidote that eradicates, that gets rid of anger inside you. And when you do that, you get to a space where you don't have anger, and then you're in bliss. Then you're blissful. And there are things that might be useful in this terrible time. But I started this podcast talking about the cathedral in Kiev and the indestructible wall, and the sense that people might believe that the Mother of God would protect them. That's my prayer as well today, that we will find protection and safety with the Great Mother. And I want to read you a piece about a different shrine, if you like, to the Mother of God, and that's in Knock. And I wrote this in the book called On Tuesdays I'm a Buddhist. And again, I'll just read it with no explanation. As I drove farther on the N17, heading for the turn at Charlestown that would take me north-east towards French Park and then Carrick-on-Shannon, I found myself passing close to the town of Knock, where I had spent an intense morning 6 months earlier. Apart from Skellig, I made another pilgrimage in 2017. It happened by accident in early January, when the Irish Times asked me to write a narrative about Knock. I thought they meant the shrine, but no, they just wanted a story from the airport. I had only been to Knock a few times as a child. The shrine of Catholic devotion never attracted me, but now they had an airport as well, and I wanted to be there very early one morning in January. Darkness still hugged the mountains. The cats were asleep in the shed. I drove down the hills towards Carrick-on-Shannon, passing a few trucks on the way. In Carrick, a woman was cutting the twine on a bundle of morning newspapers outside the Spar shop. "You're up early," she said. "I'm heading for the airport," I replied, grabbing a coffee before driving on, through Roscommon, on winding roads, past sleeping houses, where trellises of Christmas lights still hung like fairy cobwebs along the guttering of an occasional bungalow in the dark. Even along the N5 towards Westport, the road was empty, with only the lights of Ballahadreen visible in the distance, where people still lay in their beds waiting for daylight. But in the middle of Mayo, the airport stood defiant, on a hill surrounded by bogland, a miracle of light and hope. I began to meet more traffic, more headlamps, until I reached the car park where families were wheeling their luggage towards the terminal building. It's a long time since a faint glow illuminated the gable wall of a church in Knock, and folks put their hands through it to see if their gods were solid or of air. But they would have marvelled no less at the terminal building. In the XL shop that sold newspapers, chocolate and coffee, I asked the lady behind the counter where I might get breakfast. She directed me to the restaurant upstairs that was about to open. I found food and I found a quiet table, but I couldn't find any drama. I couldn't find operas of loss or heartbreak playing out before my eyes, something that might make a good column for the newspaper. I didn't see anyone faint from sadness or be dragged screaming from a barrier as their children walked away into the boarding area. All I could feel was a sense of stillness, as if there was no obvious pain involved in bidding farewell. In the 50s, things had been different. A man from Mullingar once told me about the boat he had taken long ago. There was a slatted floor where we stood, he said, and the cattle were below us. The boat rolled in the swell, and the cows messed themselves all the time with the stress, and the smell coming up through the floor took away our dignity. We felt we were not much better than cattle. It wasn't saying goodbye to our mothers that hurt, it was the lack of dignity in the leave-taking. But that's not the case now. Knock is a cathedral of dignity and restraint in the face of loss. And I sat in the restaurant in a swirl of light. Homecomings and leave-takings, funerals, christenings and holidays in Alicante were all discussed in quiet tones at other tables. Accents from London, Manchester, Glasgow, Warsaw and Belmullet wafted in the air. And yet it wasn't like an airport. The calm atmosphere had an edge to it. The stillness was potent. There was no music on the intercom, no endless stream of announcements, no manic fuss about shopping, and nobody afflicted by the mental anguish that is caused by endlessly checking Facebook. People just waited. And it was just a bit edgy with expectation, like the waiting room of a maternity suite. An old man in a cardigan read the sports page of the newspaper as he stood in the middle of the room, gazing at the departure boards. A young woman in a black leather coat and leather boots up to her arse stood beside him. I thought that they must have been from different planets, until I heard them make conversation without even looking at each other, and with such familiarity that I realized they were father and daughter. But they too seemed unusually quiet and restrained. The restaurant upstairs opened at 9 a.m, and the darkness outside dissolved in a wet drizzle. At the food counter people queued for scrambled eggs, sausages, and mugs of Bewley's coffee. Then a flight was called, and the gates opened, and I saw what I had come to see. I saw something as subtle and delicate to observe as an apparition on the gable of a church. I saw the little chink that opens sometimes in the universe, and it enables love to manifest in human form. I saw the invisible made visible, as certain as anyone might see God in a crust of bread or a child's face. And it happened again and again, each time a flight was called, and it happened at each table, between each couple, and in every family cluster. It was the small nativity that everyone had been waiting for, that strange birth of pain and love that comes unexpectedly to the human heart as a single event when a family is being rent asunder. It's called saying goodbye. This is what the long miles were about, I thought. The awkward silences, the small chats over breakfasts that no one wanted, and the pretence at reading newspapers. This is what it was all for. This was why everyone had been silent. This was the thing that no one wanted to miss, the thing that everyone wanted to get right, to say goodbye and to say it well, in gesture and in word. Gradually I saw that it was happening all around me, all the time, in 1,000 hidden moments. The farewells happened with such discretion that they were hardly noticeable, sometimes no more than a whisper in the ear, the last touch of a hand at the departure gates, a little tugging on a coat sleeve. This wasn't a single dramatic apparition of God, but 100 tiny nativities of love, shimmering in damp eyes and opening arms, the lips moving so clearly that I could spell the words. Don't forget the sausages. Say hello to everyone. Happy New Year. The last moment of physical intimacy is always a miracle. To breathe in love for a second and then hold it for another year, as if each year was an eternity. At the window, 3 brothers held a child to the glass so he could see the plane. In another corner, a woman had spread quality street sweets on the table between herself and her granddaughter as they waited for their moment, for their flight to be called that would whisk the young woman away to Birmingham so that she could return to her studies in Newcastle. A young couple held hands at the table beside me. They talked of iPads and the price of a Samsung phone. A stout elderly woman in an anorak looked on as helpless as a child until her moment approached, her own little quiet nativity about to happen. "I'll walk down with you," she said. She meant she'd go down the stairs to the gate. That was all, and her face muscles struggled to be still as pain and love wrestled inside her for dominion. Later, after a full breakfast, I walked across the car park, watching cars negotiate the security barrier. Cars with empty rear seats and no suitcases in the boot, as they journeyed back into the mists of rural Ireland. That was Knock, where people in pain said goodbye to their loved ones. I think of that and the drama that was there, and then I look at the television news and I see people separating to get on buses, knowing that the women and children heading away, leaving their men to fight, have heavy hearts. The men who stay in Kiev to fight, to protect it and to hope that the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, will enfold them in her tenderness and protect them from destruction. And the women and children who head on buses and planes to Poland and to Ireland, across the world, wondering what next is in store for them, and will they ever, ever be with their loved ones again. These are difficult times. I will continue to share with you in these podcasts my faith, even though in these days it is really difficult to maintain faith. Oh, it is difficult by the rivers of Babylon to sing the songs of the Lord. It is difficult to have faith in dark times, to hope when the atmosphere is of despair. And it is impossible to pray when I have anger in my heart. So I'm working at getting rid of the anger and creating that space which is prayer. It actually is prayer. When I let go of the anger, I am in prayer. And then things change. When I get rid of the anger, the prayer brings me to a different, more hopeful way of looking at all that crucifixion that's going on in Ukraine. So thank you for being here. Mind yourself. Bye-bye.